In 1977, archaeologists found a stone structure in northern Canada. They sent samples to 3 separate laboratories. All 3 came back with different dates. None of those results were ever published. That's not a mystery story. That's just what happens when science finds something it wasn't prepared to explain. This is a list of 12 structures scattered across Canadian soil. In the prairies, on frozen coastlines, beneath lake surfaces, deep inside permafrost, that no one has managed to date with any real confidence. Not because the technology doesn't exist. Because in most cases, the research simply stopped. Funding dried up. Reports were filed internally and never released. Studies were launched, ran into results that didn't fit, and quietly ended. What you're about to hear isn't a conspiracy. It's something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling than that. It's a pattern. Drive far enough into the Alberta prairies, and the land eventually flattens into something almost uncomfortable. No cover, no interruption, just grass and sky as far as you can see. It feels ancient out there. And in certain areas, if you know where to look, the ground itself starts to look deliberate. Scattered across the short grass prairie are arrangements of stone, low, circular, geometric. Not random. The repetition is too consistent for that. The patterns echo each other across kilometers, which means whoever placed them wasn't just passing through. They were working within a system. Some researchers have linked these formations to astronomical observation, solar alignment, lunar cycles. The Blackfoot people, whose territory this has always been, describe them differently. They say the stones were there before memory begins, not as legend, as statement of fact. The problem with dating stone arrangements is that you can't carbon date the stones themselves. You can try to date organic material found beneath them, but that only tells you the most recent time the earth was disturbed, not when the stones were first placed. So these formations sit there, in plain sight, in the middle of one of Canada's most accessible provinces, and the science stalls almost immediately. They were never hidden. That's what stays with you. These ones only reveal themselves at low tide. That's already strange. The idea that a structure could spend most of its existence underwater and only surface for a few hours, a few times a year, like it's checking whether anyone is still paying attention. Along certain stretches of the BC coast, stone walls extend into the water in formations that function as fish traps. The engineering is precise. Channels force fish inward as tides shift, directing them into enclosures where they can be harvested without nets or boats. It requires a detailed, multi-generational understanding of tidal behavior at a specific location. What nobody has managed to pin down is when this system was built. The stone can't be dated directly. The sediment around the structures gives a rough window, but in archaeological terms, a rough window can mean thousands of years of uncertainty. Some researchers estimate these traps are among the oldest human constructions on the continent. Others are more cautious. The honest answer is that no one really knows. The communities whose ancestors built these structures, and who still hold rights to the fishing grounds, were not consistently consulted in the studies that did take place. That detail tends to get buried in academic footnotes. It shouldn't. In the Yukon, workers excavating permafrost came across a series of chambers, not natural caves. The walls showed tool marks, deliberate excavation, clearly human, clearly intentional. The problem was the tool marks themselves. The pattern of the cuts didn't match the lithic technology associated with the estimated period of occupation. Whoever made those marks was using something that, according to accepted timelines, they shouldn't have had yet. The site was documented. Photos were taken, measurements recorded. And then, as tends to happen with inconvenient sites, the pace of research slowed and eventually stopped. No comprehensive excavation was ever completed. The chambers remained partially explored, which is a polite way of saying they were found, raised questions no one wanted to answer in public, and were left alone. There are researchers who know this site and won't work on it, not because they're afraid, because the institutional environment around it makes sustained, serious study almost impossible to fund. Lake Superior holds roughly 10% of the world's surface fresh water. Standing on its northern shore in autumn, when the light flattens and the wind comes straight across with nothing to break it, the scale of the place is hard to process. It doesn't feel like a lake. It feels older than that word. On certain sections of that northern shoreline, large upright stones have been placed in specific configurations. Some weigh more than 4 tons. They were not formed in place. They were brought from elsewhere and set deliberately. For the estimated period in which they were placed, no known transportation method in the region could have moved stones that size across that terrain, which means either the dating is wrong or the available technology was different from what's assumed, or both. Indigenous oral histories connected to the Superior region describe the monoliths as markers, territorial, spiritual, navigational, precise in purpose. The academic literature describes them as of uncertain origin and date. The gap between those two descriptions is not a coincidence, it's a choice. At some point in the 1980s, divers began reporting a linear formation of stone blocks on the floor of a lake in Ontario. Not scattered, arranged, running in a consistent direction for kilometers beneath the surface. The debate that followed was vigorous for a while. Natural formation or human construction? The geometry argued for the latter. The absence of funding argued against conclusive research. By the mid-1990s, the active investigation had essentially stopped. No institution picked it up again. What's left is a documented formation that no one has officially explained, surrounded by a scientific conversation that ran out of momentum before reaching any answer. That's not resolution. That's abandonment dressed up as uncertainty. The structure is still there, under the water, in the dark. This is where things change. This is where the list shifts from fascinating to genuinely disruptive. Bluefish Caves is a real site, documented in peer-reviewed literature. In the 1970s and 80s, researcher Laurence Bourgeon and her team found animal bones with cut marks, unmistakably human, unmistakably deliberate. The bones dated to approximately 24,000 years ago. That date matters enormously. The accepted model for human arrival in the Americas places the first people crossing from Asia somewhere between 15,000 and 16,000 years ago, after the ice sheets retreated enough to allow passage. Bluefish Caves puts humans in the Yukon 9,000 years before that window opens. When the findings were first published, the response from the academic establishment was not enthusiasm, it was resistance. The site was disputed, the methodology questioned, the conclusions minimized. It took decades before the evidence was widely accepted, and even now the full implications have not been integrated into what's taught in schools or displayed in museums. The site remains only partially excavated. There is almost certainly more to find. The question of why the excavation hasn't continued is not a scientific question. Along the Milk River Valley in southern Alberta, the hoodoos, those strange wind-carved sandstone columns, create a landscape that already feels like it exists slightly outside of normal time. Carved into the rock faces are thousands of images, figures in motion, animals, geometric symbols, records of encounters and events and things that mattered enough to be made permanent. The Blackfoot call this place Isinaipi. They describe the images not as art, but as documentation, a record of real events extending further back than oral memory can reach. The challenge for dating is fundamental. You cannot carbon date sandstone. Pigments used in some images can sometimes be tested, but the engravings, the majority of the site, resist any direct chronometric method. Indirect techniques were attempted and produced results so varied they were effectively useless. Some of the images show events that Blackfoot oral tradition places before the arrival of horses on the plains, which makes those specific images at least 400 years old. Others, the elders say, are much older than that. How much older, the science cannot say. The site now carries UNESCO World Heritage designation. The age remains unknown. In a field in Manitoba, there is a large circular stone arrangement, different in scale and deliberateness from the more common prairie configurations. And the stones themselves are not from the immediate area. They were transported from source rock located hundreds of kilometers away. Moving them required planning, coordination, and a reason substantial enough to organize a significant community effort across a very long distance. No dating study on this specific structure has ever been completed and published. There are survey records, photographic documentation, some academic acknowledgement that it exists. But the sustained, funded research that would establish a timeline hasn't happened. The structure sits in a field. You can visit it. You can stand inside the ring and look at the stones and know that someone, at some point, moved them a very long way and placed them with care. The rest is silence. Haida Gwaii is an archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia that was geographically isolated from the mainland for most of the last ice age. The Haida people have inhabited these islands for an extraordinarily long time. Oral traditions describe continuous presence reaching back into periods that Western archaeology is only beginning to take seriously. Along the coastline, particularly in areas now accessible only by boat, there are structures built into the rock. Their positioning relative to the current shoreline suggests they were built when sea levels were significantly lower, which places their construction during or shortly after the last glacial maximum, roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. If that's accurate, these are among the oldest human constructions in North America. Research on these sites is genuinely difficult. Access is challenging, the marine environment complicates dating, and the Haida Nation's involvement in any study is both ethically required and practically essential. Some collaborative work has begun. It moves slowly. The structures are being eroded by rising sea levels faster than they're being studied. There is a kind of loss happening here that doesn't make headlines. Interior British Columbia, away from the coast, away from the more documented sites. There are funerary structures here whose internal geometry doesn't correspond to any known tradition from the Pacific Northwest. Spiral configurations, not circular, not linear, spiral, with chambers arranged in a pattern that has no clear parallel in the documented archaeological record of the region. The communities whose ancestors may have built these structures have their own relationships to these places, and many have expressed deep discomfort with the kind of invasive study these sites have historically attracted. When researchers did access some of the internal chambers for sampling, the dates that came back created a problem. The researchers described the results, in internal correspondence that was later partially disclosed, as inconsistent with expected parameters. One described them as technically impossible given the accepted framework. Those results were not published. The decision was framed as methodological caution. There is another word for it. The structures remain. The dates remain unknown, and the communities who hold the memory of these places are still waiting to be asked what they already know. Seen from the air, a series of stone structures distributed across a stretch of Saskatchewan landscape form something that, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. A system of alignments tracking solar and lunar events across the seasons. Individual structures connect to others across distances of kilometers. The geometry is too consistent to be accidental. This is not one person or one generation making a structure. This is coordinated, sustained, intentional construction that required astronomical knowledge precise enough to function across decades, possibly centuries. No Canadian academic institution has committed funding to a full dating program for this complex. There have been surveys. There have been papers describing the alignments. The sustained study that would produce dates complicating the official history of human settlement in the region has not been done. That's not for lack of knowing it exists. Everyone in the relevant fields knows it exists. The question of why the work hasn't been done is one those researchers are careful not to answer directly. This one is different in kind from everything else on this list. During infrastructure work in the high Canadian Arctic, the specifics of which remain vague in any document ever made public, workers uncovered a stone structure. It was photographed. A report was filed internally within a federal government agency. Neither the photographs nor the report have ever been released. What is known comes from two sources: fragments of information surfaced through access to information requests that returned heavily redacted documents, and the oral traditions of Inuit communities in the surrounding region. The Inuit description of the structure, passed through generations, is precise enough to be remarkable. They describe it as something built before the cold came, before the Arctic became the Arctic, which would place its construction before the far north's climate became what it is today, potentially tens of thousands of years ago. The Government of Canada has not acknowledged the site publicly. The research was suspended. No follow-up study was authorized. The area sits in a region where federal jurisdiction is near total, and public access requires permission that is not granted. What was found there, photographed, documented, and then quietly buried in a file somewhere in Ottawa, no one outside a small group of federal employees knows for certain. And that, maybe, is the most important part of this entire list. Not the structures that science can't date. The structures that someone decided science shouldn't. There's a version of Canadian history that begins with Europeans arriving on a coastline and encountering wilderness. That version is still taught, still repeated. It requires, to stay coherent, that the land before contact was essentially empty of organized, complex, persistent human civilization. These 12 structures, and the dozens more like them that didn't make this list, are a problem for that version of history. Not because they prove a specific alternative, but because they exist, because they were built, because they required organization, knowledge, intention, and time. The science hasn't failed to date them because the task is technically impossible. It has failed because the task has not been seriously, consistently, persistently attempted. And when attempts produced inconvenient results, those results were archived rather than published, questioned rather than built upon, silenced rather than answered. The ground holds what it holds. The stones don't move. Somewhere in the permafrost, in the lake beds, on the coastlines, the evidence for a human history on this continent that is exponentially older and more sophisticated than any official narrative admits is waiting. Not to be discovered. It has already been found. It's waiting to be acknowledged.